By fans, for fans, the Hog Style. And now, here's your host, Sean Conti.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Hog Style. We have a jam-packed show for you this week because there was actual Redskins news, which we haven't seen in almost a month, it feels like. And we also have a special guest, one of our favorite reoccurring guests that we ever have on the show. Mark Bullock is joining us this time, not from England, but from the mainland in UK. He's in Sweden, so that's interesting. That expands our audience somehow, I think. That's good.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, good. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.
By the way, that's Alex. I'm Steve. Jamal's here. Sean's out.
Yeah. We don't know where Sean is. He's doing one of his sabbaticals. So,
he's praying. That's all he's doing.
Yeah.
Give him time.
Maybe he's doing our taxes.
He better be doing our taxes.
That's an inside thing between all of us.
He needs to pay Mark for this appearance too.
Right. We're making him pay for appearances now. We have like I said, we have a jam-packed show. There were some roster moves made. We brought Mark on really to start talking to us about some of the X's and O's we're going to see next year. But I want to start with a poll that Steve did on wide receivers because that'll kind of dovetail nicely into everything else. So, Steve, why don't you tell us what the poll was, and we'll kind of give our reactions.
Okay, so I did this poll prior to the Redskins making the roster moves they made on Friday, but this ended up being a pretty apropos poll, so, hooray for timing. So the poll question this week was, understanding that the Redskins are implementing Scott Turner's offense next season, do the Redskins need a new starting wide receiver opposite Terry McLaurin? Please vote and comment. And I just noticed just now that I misspelled Terry McLaurin with only one R. Sorry about that, Terry. So the options here... Yeah, he might. He probably can. I'm sure he can too. Okay, so the responses, the proposed responses were no. Let's just roll with Harmon and Sims. And by Sims, I meant Steve Sims, and ran out of characters. Yes, spend a high draft pick, or yes, spend big money on a free agent. And I left off the obvious, which was, sign a mediocre free agent because, number one, that's probably not a big name starter. Number two, they're going to do that no matter what. I'm talking about, do you make a bold move by either just forgetting that, going with Harmon or Sims? Do you spend like a first or second round draft pick on a wide receiver, or do you sign like an AJ Green type? Those are the choices.
Green, not Antonio Brown. We're just going to say no Antonio Brown.
Yeah, forget him. Yeah. So those are the choices. So what we always do with this thing, Mark, if you've forgotten, is we always try to predict what the audience thinks and we give our opinions on it. Since you're our guest, you don't have to predict if you don't want, but what are your thoughts on the poll and wide receivers?
I would guess the poll, I think they would probably say go sign a big name free agent wide receiver.
Okay. Your thoughts?
Personally, Ben Standard and I, my colleague on The Athletic, we looked at the wide receiver stuff. We were looking at a bigger overall free agency collaboration between us, and we were looking at the free agent wide receivers. And outside of the likes of Amari Cooper or Robbie Anderson, who are going to get the top money, there's kind of not a lot on offer there. So unless you want to go all in on someone like Amari Cooper, which I don't necessarily think is completely out of the question, but it would eat up a big chunk of their budget, then I think you're probably better off looking in the draft in what's a kind of a deeper draft class. Okay.
Alex?
I think Mark brings up a good point about the draft class being a deep one. And if those are my options and I can't do, what I really want to do, which is sign a 34-year-old slot receiver just to kind of mentor everybody.
You can do that. I'm just saying that's not. That's not the solution.
Right. That's not in the poll. I'm going to probably look at the draft if I'm picking, and I'm going to guess the fans are going to say stick with what we got though, because I think fans are weird and they don't like spending money.
Well, fans are weird, that's for sure. Yeah. Okay, Jamal, your turn. What do you think?
Give me my guide pick. It would be Hill, the other receiver out of Ohio State.
Yeah, smart move.
Yeah.
Jamal?
So for me, I think that the fans actually, I kind of agree with Alex in the sense that, I kind of think they're going to be like stand pat in a sense. They and I kind of I like what's his name, Harmon and Steven Sims too. But I think that even though they're still developing and they're in year two, you kind of still need playmakers. And I also think you need veteran experience. And with that being said, I don't know what the plans are with Cincinnati and AJ Green, but if you can try to lure him away from a contender, it's worth keeping him around for a year or two. And at that point, you'll have these younger guys who are developing, and they came into their own by that time. And you don't have to worry about AJ Green. And shoot, hopefully you make playoff runs with AJ on your team. But outside of that, that's the only person that I would value in terms of his experience and his skill set. He was a top 5 receiver for X amount of years. Injuries just hurt him, but it doesn't. You have plenty of money to play around with, and he's a guy that he's a proven receiver. So it's not like he's a wash or anything. He just battled with health injuries, and last year he was actually healthy. He just didn't play.
Yeah. Okay. So the fans, it was a very close vote, but the fans sided with Mark. 47% of you out there said yes, sign the big name free agent. I think that's kind of the way the fans think. The fans kind of think usually the free agency is a panacea for your problems. So that's what I would have predicted. 44% said no, just go with Harmon and Sims, and a mere 9% of you want to draft like Judy from Alabama or somebody like that, and a high draft pick. Personally, prior to the cut of Paul Richardson, I would have said let's just stand pat and hope that Richardson can perform. But now that Richardson's gone, I do think they need to bring somebody in. So if they could get AJ Green for a reasonable price, it doesn't cost them a fortune.
Right.
Locks him in for a bunch of years. Yeah, I think that would probably be best.
I think AJ
from Spot Rockies expected $9 million a year. That's his projection.
The Redskins can do that, and I care less about the year-to-year amount than I do them getting locked into some gigantic deal.
Long term, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. There's a bunch of comments, but in light of the fact that Mark is here, we're going to forego our normal perusal through the comments section. But there's a bunch of
because I assume Dave's just in there. We always have this one guy, Dave Mark, who
I don't think Dave commented, but our buddy John Worrell commented on this thing. But John, if you're going to send me a comment, it can't be so long that I'm just going to be reading it forever on the air. So make it short.
John's got nothing to do. You know what he's up to these days.
I know, but you're 4 points and long. I can't read it. So we'll skip the comments today. But no, I didn't see Dave in there. But we had a lot of comments, so I might have missed it.
Okay. Well, you kind of mentioned the next topic, and let's talk about it now. And that is that the Redskins made a bunch of cuts to the roster, but 2 of them are big names, starters, or kind of starters. Paul Richardson was the first one that you mentioned already. 2 years into his 4-year deal, he's gone. Constantly hurt in the time he was here. I pulled up his numbers: 507 yards, 4 touchdowns, 48 catches over 2 seasons. That's bad.
So it is. So Mark, what are your thoughts on the contractual demise of Josh Norman and Paul Richardson?
Yeah, I think you have 2 different situations there. I think with Norman, you had a player that never lived up to the contract that he was given. He was obviously given the best contract any corner had ever got at that time. And so he was expected to be a big difference playmaker. And I think that kind of took him out of what he was best at, which was in Carolina when he played zone and he fit that scheme perfectly, and he executed that scheme perfectly. And then in Washington, they brought him over and paid him a bunch of money, and then we're paying you this much money, so you've got to be able to follow receivers and play man to man and play all these different things, and he didn't play it as well. I think there were certainly times throughout his career in Washington where he was better than what people thought. And I think in general, I think he was better than what people thought. I think people had a tendency to see a player run by him deep and then assume that it was his fault when he was meant to have some sort of safety help or he was responsible for an underneath zone. But certainly, I don't think anyone could argue he didn't live up to the contract that he was given, and that's both on the Redskins and on Norman. But I think in general he was a decent player, and I think he will go on to play decent, meaningful football for someone in the next few years. But for Richardson, I think that was a contract that was given to him based on wanting to replace Deshaun Jackson, and I kind of feel like, why didn't they just go and re-sign Deshaun Jackson?
Right.
and he's again, I don't think he necessarily was as bad as people thought. The injuries obviously kept him off the field and limited him a little bit, but there were certainly times when he was running open deep and he wasn't found by whatever quarterback was under center. So he did his job occasionally, but he didn't, because they weren't hitting him on those consistently, teams weren't respecting him the way they respected Deshaun. And so he didn't demand a safety over cheating to his side of the field to open something up for, like Deshaun always demanded a safety over the top. So right. Jordan Reed would get free or Pierre Garçon would get one-on-one, whereas Richardson didn't demand that. So simply because they didn't hit him often enough. So, you know, I still think Richardson will go on to contribute for someone. I still think he's a decent player, and I think he had better games than what people remember, but he probably wasn't worth the contract he was given at the time, and they certainly didn't use him anywhere near as effectively as they could have.
Well, I think with Richardson, let's put even, I gave his basic numbers. He played 17 games, and so let's say that's roughly a full season, because I'm sure he was hurt for parts of those games too.
Yeah.
500 yards, 48 catch. Those are number 3 guy numbers, which is what he was in Seattle. He was a number 3 guy. And they brought him here thinking he could. You make the Deshaun comparison. I compare it a little to the Pierre Garçon signing in that you brought in a guy who was somebody else's number 3 thinking he could become your number 1. It just didn't work this time. With Pierre Garçon, he became one of the most productive receivers in team history in terms of, catches per season and all that kind of stuff.
But they had very different kind of skill sets, whereas Pierre Garçon was a much more physical receiver that you could kind of heavily lean on and throw in the ball on the quick underneath stuff. And I think Richardson, from a route running perspective, was decent at doing that kind of thing. It's just his body couldn't handle taking the hits that he would get from running those shorter routes and running over the middle. So
Pierre Garçon was a tough guy.
Yeah, so my thought, I didn't like, well, first of all, on Norman, I tend to side with Mark on it also. I always thought he was a little bit better than the fans gave him credit for, but there's no doubt that certainly the last 2 years he was utterly not worth it in terms of contractual value versus production, and it's probably best that he's gone. Good luck. I thought the fans were pretty rude to him, frankly, there toward the end. So, I mean, the team's better off without that. But good luck. In terms of Richardson, I never liked the Richardson signing from the word one. Just watching him in Seattle, I thought he was kind of a bad fit with the Seahawks because to me, Richardson's a guy who isn't Deshaun Jackson, even though that's what the Redskins wanted him to do. He's not the type that can just turn on the jets and burn straight by a corner or a safety on a 9 route necessarily. And like you said, Mark, you demand safety help and all that. He's more of a guy who needs, small windows where he can get open, and then the ball needs to be delivered to him on time. And that's not really what Russell Wilson does. Russell Wilson extends. Mm-hmm. He's scrambling around. He cuts off half of the field, and it works for him. But I didn't think that fit for Paul Richardson. And I didn't think his production justified such an enormous contract, but in terms of his injuries, it really kept him from really ever getting in the flow of the offense. And so while I think he has some talent, I don't think it ever really worked here for those reasons. And it's certainly best that the team moves on. So that's my thought.
I mean, I think that's fair with Richardson. I got to disagree with you guys on Norman, though. I think Paul, injuries, I can excuse that. Josh Norman, never cared about playing football. Like, he had one good season here. The rest were below average to terrible. The quarterback rating against him the last 2 years, 129 and 109. I mean, unfortunately, Pro Football Reference doesn't seem to go back more than 2 years on their advanced corner stats, which I found odd. I couldn't find what he did those 2 first seasons. But he's just, all the off-season stuff where he was always doing, running with the Bulls or dancing with the Stars. He never rubbed me the right way. I always thought we spent a lot of money on a corner who was not a good fit as a number one, and he's.
But are you sure he didn't care about football?
It didn't look like he cared about football.
All right.
Jamal,
Well,
give your opinion. I mean, yeah, I disagree with Alex, but go ahead, Jamal.
I don't. What I will say, because it was kind of funny. I woke up and saw, that little. Remember we had talked yesterday, Steve, and you had mentioned that you felt like, he was a lot of fans had been unnecessarily rude in a sense.
Yeah.
And I agree with that aspect. And the only reason why I would bring that up is because the fact that Norman, to Steve and Mark's point, Norman had his good days and he had his bad days, but people really honed in on his bad days and figured that was him all the time, and it wasn't really the case. He's had games where he's played good and he's gotten no credit. But then, early on, obviously when he got here, that's Redskins fans, like a fan's nature. They're going to defend their players to the very end. So of course, his good games are going to be highlighted then, but when it starts muddying the waters and you get to 2018 and 2019, all they see is bad. And all they see is him putting up his arms and struggling like, what the hell just happened on the field? And they see him getting burnt. I'm not going to go through that again because you all already covered it. But I just feel like a lot of people have, over the last 2 years, the instances have accumulated to a point where they see that he has done no right. And they value the team so much that they feel like Norman stole their money too. But I mean, he really didn't. He had his good days and he had his bad days. I just think that he has to go to a team where the scheme fits him, and obviously because of these last 2 years, he's going to go to a team where he's not pressured into being a number one corner. He has his time. He can be very selective, and it comes down to who he has on the field with him, who he can trust at safety, what his defensive coordinator wants for him. And, whatever that is, he's going to – that's the decision that he can make.
Real quick, before we move on to why Mark is actually here, I don't want to go over a detailed salary cap thing because we'll do that on another show, but I did update it, and the Redskins have about $57 million in available space as a result of these cuts. So
yeah,
we'll do a detailed breakdown of that on another show.
Well, and we got to get it.
Did my mic cut out?
Yeah, you dropped out there for a bit, Jamal, but
oh, that's crazy. I was talking this whole time. I was like, I made some really good points, and then
we heard most of it.
Yeah, we got the gist of it. All right, well, let's move on. Sorry, well, Jamal, worst case, we can have you re-say whatever you want to say, and I'll edit it.
I talk way too long.
Yeah, that's all right. That's why you're on here. We want you to talk. But let's have Mark actually talk now, because what we brought you on, Mark, to talk about initially was the Redskins' new offensive coordinator, Scott Turner. It looks like a big departure for the team. First time in 10 years of going away from a West Coast offense, or how that terminology, that philosophy, and going back to what this team used to do well, which is more of an Air Coryell thing. But we wanted you to really break it all down for us better than just us using those general broad terms.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, you're right. It's the first time in sort of 10 or so years that they've not been in a West Coast offense of some sort. And they had it with Jim Zorn, and they had it with Mike Shanahan, and then Jay Gruden. So it's been a while. And honestly, it's the offense that I know best. So it's going to be some adjustment for me learning the new system as well. But it's something that I know some people prefer it because the West Coast offense, from a terminology standpoint, people hate that the West Coast offense is so wordy. And that's always been a thing that I've not necessarily agreed with, because a lot of it can be quite quick with terms of with certain words for concepts and stuff. And people can get put off by formation names and stuff like that. But when you get your head around it, the actual language of it makes sense. It just takes a minute to get your head around it.
Right.
But with the Air Corral system, it's a number system. So you learn a 7 route is a outbreaking corner route or a deep out. Then an 8 route is a post route, and a 3 route is a quick out, and that kind of thing. You learn exactly what each route is, and each route is given a number. And there's more routes than the numbers 1 to 9, so the different routes get slightly different adjustments on different plays. So an 8 route might be a post route on one play, it might be a skinny post on another, it might be a more harsher break off on another. So that is another thing that you have to learn. But when you learn an 8 route as a post, it's a post. And then rather than calling a play a quick seam, you might call it 525 F post, and then that tells all the receivers their numbers, their routes, and it tells the back their responsibility, and it's much easier to grasp and much easier to get a hold of. So from that point of view, I think a younger quarterback like Haskins will probably benefit, although it's not ideal to have him learning an entire new system for a second year running. Philosophically, the offense traditionally is a little bit more downfield than a West Coast offense. I would say, to that point, though, Jay Gruden's version of a West Coast offense was more downfield than other West Coast offenses. And the Scott Turner system, and to be fair, they had their better players were the likes of Christian McCaffrey and Greg Olsen and people that worked underneath, but it wasn't always attacking down the field. That being said, you have a guy like Terry McLaurin, you're going to attack down the field. So, and traditionally, it's a system that is based on attacking more down the field, and then being able to defeat teams by formations and motions. And I think you saw that a lot last year with the Panthers, where they had Christian McCaffrey obviously was the highlight of the offense, and because he was the best player, they made him the feature point, and they would move him around, line him up at running back, move him out to the wide receiver, and then sometimes line him up as receiver and motion him back into the backfield. And they'd move him around a lot with a guy, Samuel, the receiver Samuel, who played some running back in college, and often they'd have Samuel line up in the slot and they'd have McCaffrey in the backfield, and then they'd shift them where McCaffrey would go split out wide and Samuel would come back in and sometimes run a play, be given a handoff from the backfield. So they did a lot of different things like that mess with defensive personnel groupings and make the defense kind of play as vanilla as possible, which it makes it easier for the quarterback. So I think what we'll see from Scott Turner, you have a piece like Steven Sims that can do a lot of what Samuel did. Whether you have a running back, Bryce Love potentially, Darius Geis potentially, that could do similar things to McCaffrey. Maybe they look to add another piece there, but he likes to be able to go empty and line up a running back outside and create mismatches that way. So
you mean more of a dual threat type running back, right?
Yeah, not an Adrian Peterson type that's just a downhill runner and doesn't catch the ball. Someone like Geis that can catch the ball. Bryce Love never really caught the ball at Stanford, but that he was drafted with the potential skill set to take over from someone like Chris Thompson, who could catch the ball at the backfield, or line up at receiver. So that's the type of guy that they might look to add, unless Bryce Love is fully healthy and they're really confident in that pick. But they might still look to add someone there, and that does a lot for keeping a defense vanilla, and that helps the a younger quarterback a lot.
Mark, I guess it's not really a concern so much, but what I'm wondering here is, did we see something different in the Carolina offense in the last month of the season last year? Because, Scott Turner was the quarterback's coach under Ron Rivera, and then Rivera got fired, and then Turner was made into the interim offensive coordinator in that last month of the season. So is there anything that we can glean that was different from the Panthers in the last quarter of the season?
Well, the couple of things I would say on that is that from my understanding from one or two people I've spoken to, is that Scott Turner was pretty heavily involved in game planning and before he was made the offensive coordinator. Obviously, Norv, his dad, was on that staff and in charge of calling plays, but from my understanding, Norv had been kind of setting it up for Scott to take over and kind of preparing him for an offensive coordinator job anyway. So from all of the game planning stuff and designing plays throughout the week, I think Scott Turner had a big influence on that throughout the years that both the Turners were there anyway. So the only thing that really changed, as I understand it, is that he took over the play calling rather than like any of the game plans themselves really changed. And it's hard to read too much into those games that he did coordinate because of the quarterback situation. They had Kyle Allen, and then they had pressure to play the rookie Will Grier. And they didn't have, the number one quarterback in Cam Newton available to him. So he wasn't able to run everything he wanted to. He had to kind of cater to those guys. So that it's kind of difficult to read too much into just those last 4 games.
Mark, talking about this, I'm starting to ponder what big changes do you think they need to make to this roster this year for Turner to be successful? Obviously, when I hear Eric Coryell, I think about more of a traditional running out of the eye kind of, power run setup, because I know that's always been big with that offense.
Mm.
And, the West Coast doesn't necessarily do that very much.
No.
But, what do you think they need to focus on in free agency? What do you think they need to focus on roster-wise? Where would you go there?
So the offense, the thing that I did notice from Turner over the couple of years, I've been watching back a lot of the Panthers film, and he does tailor his scheme to the players he has available to him. So when he's had Greg Olsen, he's done things with a tight end to make Greg Olsen, the one of the primary reads. And when he's had DJ Moore as a deep threat, he catered the offense to, open those things up to him. And he, more in his rookie year, wasn't the best route runner. He ran certain routes well, and he ran others not so well. So he would, limit those routes that he ran and be like, okay, well, he can only run 4 or 5 routes, so let's only call these 4 or 5 routes for him. So he does tailor his offense to his personnel. So in that regard, I think what we'll see from him is we'll see Sims in a similar role to what they had with Curtis Samuel, and he'll move around and similar to what we saw with him this year out of Steven Sims, with a lot of the jet sweeps and moving around in the backfield and sometimes isolating him on one side, using that speed to clear out from the slot or win with quickness underneath. And if they potentially go for someone like Greg Olsen, he can bring a lot with how he can clear space for his teammates. I think tight end's probably their biggest need on offense right now. If we go on the assumption, which is a fairly big assumption, that Trent Williams is back.
And you mentioned Greg Olsen. He's supposedly negotiating with the Redskins, Seahawks, and I can't remember who the third team is.
It was the Buffalo Bills.
Bills, thank you. And at the time that we're recording this, he hasn't signed with anybody. But
let's stop. Yeah. Let's stop right there. Number one, the rumor I heard just this morning, off the record, is that the chances are very, very high that Jordan Reed really is going to retire. So take that for what you will. And we said that months ago, when
I think everyone
told you guys
that.
Yeah. But I heard that this morning. But in terms of Greg Olsen, Mark, I'm curious as to hear what you think about Greg Olson. He seems an obvious fit. He was obviously in Carolina before. I mean, he's had a myriad of injuries in the past, 2 seasons. So I think while from my perspective, it'd be great to have him here. Obviously, he's not a long-term solution. You got to pay him something commensurate with the idea that he's going to miss some games, which if there's competition for a signing, they might not be able to do. But what do you think about bringing Greg Olson here?
I wrote a piece about this on Thursday, actually, and I think he would be a good signing for a certain amount of money. I'm not sure exactly how much that is, but I think he would be a good signing. Obviously, there's the fit with Rivera, and the tight ends coach is the only one he knew in Carolina, so there's obvious fits, obvious links there, and obviously Scott Turner and what have you. There's plenty of links to the staff, and the comfort level would be good, and he'd fit in the locker room, and all that. On the field, he's not gonna run by anyone necessarily. He's not what Vernon Davis is now, where he's in his mid-30s and still able to run away from people. Right. And he's not going to win with quickness like Jordan Reed did. How he wins is understanding his role within the offense, but also why his routes are being run ways they are to open up other things. So the typical one is that he'll find space in zone coverages and sit down and break off his routes and make himself available to the quarterback, which a lot of people can do. But he understands, if I'm running this route and I see this defender playing with this kind of leverage, I can kind of get in the way of that defender, and that will open up a hole for another route that's behind me. And that's something that they did a lot in Carolina with Christian McCaffrey. They would often have McCaffrey run a little angle route out of the backfield, and Olsen would run a little sort of pivot out route at 10 yards depth. And if he read that it was zone coverage, he would take those underneath the linebacker and he'd kind of get in his way and open up things for McCaffrey underneath. So that he understands leverage and how to win with leverage and route running, but he also understands how to open things up for his teammates when he's going to be covered. And that is a valuable trait. So as a receiver, he can certainly still contribute. As a blocker, he won't contribute much at all. And I think what Turner did pretty well, or what the Panthers did pretty well with him, was they didn't ask him to block that much. They would do things like run him off to the flat to make it think like it was a play action. They would send him up the seam on a RPO. They would have him kind of dummy block and peel off and do lots of things where he was occupying a defender but not actually having to block him. And that was kind of the most effective way he could block. He when he was asked to straight up just block like a defensive end in a zone scheme, he didn't manage to do it very well. So as a blocker, he doesn't offer much.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as sort of a Jason Witten in Dallas kind of situation, where Witten is kind of the same, similar player. He's not going to beat anybody with quickness, obviously. He's not going to win many blocking assignments. It seems like that's maybe the model. But it really, Mark, you mentioned Dwayne Haskins a little bit earlier when you were talking. I like to dive a little bit deeper into that, actually. I think that my initial thought is that Haskins may be more better suited to an Eric Coryell style offense than a West Coast offense. I'm not sure Haskins is best when he has to, get rid of the ball instantaneously underneath, a lot of underneath routes. I kind of think Haskins is a little bit better if he has deeper drops and time to scan the field, because he did that a lot at Ohio State, and I think he didn't get really enough credit for that. So talk to us about Haskins in the West Coast versus Eric Coryell.
Well, I would disagree slightly. I think when he was at his best last year, he was using quick game concepts and getting the ball out of hand quickly and having his first or second read being open quickly and getting to it. And I think the key for Haskins, he can run a lot of different schemes. I think the key for him is knowledge of the offense and understanding the offense. And obviously that's key for any quarterback, but particularly Haskins, I think when he is confident in what he's doing and he's confident that yes, this receiver is definitely running this route, and I've called everything correctly, then I think that's when he executes best. And I think that's what we saw as the year went on. He got more and more comfortable with the terminology, and Kevin O'Connell did a good job of scaling everything back for him. And he was getting the ball out of his hand quickly and efficiently, and that's when we saw the offense execute as better as they had all season. So I think quick game stuff is certainly something that Haskins can do well, and does do well. And he has a quick release and he's able to get the ball out of his hands really quick, and he can process information really quickly. And that was something that stood out to me when I watched him in college, was how quickly he could read something simple like a curl flat, or in the West Coast offense is called Hank, and he would quickly be able to recognize, okay, it's this coverage, so that route's going to be covered and this route is going to be open, so it works from 1 to 2 to 3 and quickly gets the ball out on time. And I think that is something that the West Coast offense tends to lend itself to more than this system. But that being said, Turner likes to spread the ball out and spread the offense out and run empty a lot, and that lends itself more to that kind of quick game concept, finding your right matchup, and kind of in a Patriot style, matching up Julian Edelman in the slot on a linebacker, and that's my go-to matchup, so I'm going to go to that one. And so I think that is something that Turner will look to use Haskins on, and do more often than not. That being said, there's going to be shots down the field. I mean, you don't have that kind of arm without taking that kind of shot down the field. And when you have a guy like Terry McLaurin, you can take those shots. They might be more off of play action, and Turner did a lot of play action. So the kind of fake that power run game and drop back deep, and they keep extra. They kept more in protection than Gruden did. Gruden liked to use play action, but he would send probably 4, if not all 5 eligibles out, whereas Turner often would use play action and keep 7 or sometimes even 8 in to protect, and then just 1 or 2 routes. So then it kind of relies a lot on that one route getting open, whereas Gruden gave them more options. But I think they will still attack down the field, but I think it will be a lot more quick game stuff that we'll see from it.
That's interesting. And so you're thinking not a lot of 7-step drops then, I assume? Because I was just assuming you'd have 5 and 7, a lot of 5 and 7-step drops under an Eric Coryell system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that won't happen. They will still get to those. But I think from what I saw from Turner and what I saw from what Haskins did well at the end of the year, I think you'll see more of the kind of Brady-esque offense where you're spreading the defense out, you're picking your matchup, and you're kind of dropping back and quickly getting the ball out of your hands and letting a guy like Steven Sims beat a guy quickly and get after the catch yards, and a guy like Terry McLaurin can do the same. And it was a lot of different formations and motions to generate a specific matchup. So
I mean, we've been talking about the pass game a lot now, but real quick, running game. Does Turner prefer? I mean, I know he had Christian McCaffrey, so that makes, it makes you want to do certain things in the run game. But do you think he prefers more of a zone scheme versus a power scheme, or is this going to be another Jay Gruden, I want to do everything situation?
They did run a pretty wide range of things. It wasn't all zone, it wasn't all power or gap. It was kind of a mix, which I personally tend to like to kind of try to specialize in one or the other, and then maybe sprinkle in stuff. But we saw with the 49ers this year that you can have success running more than just one scheme. Like Kyle Shanahan and Mike McDaniel, they specialize in zone, but they opened up in the playbook and ran a lot more gap and power stuff. So and they had great success with it. So I think that what we'll see is probably more leaning towards the gap and power scheme stuff. Right. They ran a lot of trap systems and certainly a lot of power and counter stuff. But I mean, zone schemes are in almost every offense. In fact, they are in every offense in the NFL. Like if you're running out of the gun, you're probably running inside zone. So they will certainly have some of that in there as well.
But do you think they're going to bring Adrian Peterson back?
That's a tough one because North Turner had him in Minnesota, I believe, and so obviously there is some sort of history there. But from what Scott Turner liked to do last year, and it's hard to go on because he worked with personnel that like McCaffrey, where they were good at moving around and playing wide receiver, and if you didn't do that, then you were not using all of his talents. So if you had Adrian Peterson, he'd probably line up more in the eye and run power and stuff rather than move him around. But I think if Turner had his choice, he'd prefer a running back that was a little bit more versatile and they could generate those matchups. So I would think with the health questions surrounding both Geis and Bryce Love, I would think they probably keep Adrian Peterson. But personally, myself, I would probably look to move on from Peterson and maybe you draft a guy, maybe you sign a cheap free agent, you get an undrafted free agent or something like that, and give him more of the skill set that they had from McCaffrey. But with the injury question marks over those guys, maybe you keep Adrian Peterson because he's proven he can handle the load.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a column about this last week, and my thought on it was, with the questions surrounding the health of both Darius Geis and Bryce Love, and Jamal, by the way, wrote a good free agent running back column 2 weeks ago about this. There's no guarantee we can sign a guy like Carlos Hyde, who isn't versatile anyway in his own right, or Jordan Howard. Those are the guys that Jamal mentioned. So my concern was that they may run out of options and have to rely on health that doesn't exist if they don't bring Peterson back. It seemed to me to be kind of the safe, conservative thing to do because at least you know what you have and he's going to be there. That was kind of my thought on it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Sorry, go on, Jamal.
I was just gonna say to add on to that, so I kind of feel like from a projection standpoint, you know that Adrian Peterson, like the age does not get in the way of his production, and that's been the case for the last 3 years. I just saw your message, Steve. But that's just is it better?
No.
I'm so don't worry about it.
No, it's that standard thing it always does at 40 minutes where the mic overheats or whatever.
Sorry about that, folks. Jamal, I'm sure Jamal had a great point to make.
I understood most of it until he's saying Adrian Peterson, ageless wonder. Yeah, we all get it.
Yeah. So okay. So anyway, Mark. Cam Sims. See, this guy has been my football man crush since he came here because I think he has a good skill set. I think he was underused at Alabama. I'm wondering if they can't use him in the slot. He did play. That's what he ran at Alabama was slot. So what do you think? Does Cam Sims have a role? Is he just a piece? Is he just irrelevant? What? Cam Sims in Scott Turner offense?
Yeah, I don't think he's irrelevant. I think he has a role. I think all of those young guys you're talking about, like Cam Sims and Kelvin Harmon, and they all have that a role within the system. And I think that I don't think that Cam Sims is a guaranteed cut now that they've had a new system, no new regime takeover. I think he can certainly make the team. I don't think he is necessarily someone they've got earmarked down as we want him to be our number one receiver, or we think he can start at X or Z, or we think he can take over from Steven Sims or Trey Quinn in the slot. I think he's he's certainly, as you say, he's got a unique skill set. He's very good at the catch point, and he's got a big body a big frame that can hold off defenders, and he can create something after the catch. So I think there's something there to work with. I don't know if he's more than a guy at this point, and maybe he is, and maybe develops, and he's someone that I've liked whenever I've watched him play, but I don't think he is someone that will necessarily be prominent in their thoughts right now.
You're gonna break my heart, man.
Yeah, sorry about that.
The Redskins have so many of these young receivers. You know it's going to shake out with somebody being on the short end of the stick. That's the problem, especially if they draft or sign anybody.
Yeah.
Well, let's sum this up. Are we going to see an offense that is ultimately more productive than the one Jay Gruden ran, assuming health? I mean, because that's obviously a huge issue.
Yeah, I think the buck stops at Haskins, and that's kind of a cop out to say, it depends on Haskins how he develops. If everything, I think if he buys in and he does the work that they're looking for him to do, I think he will succeed in the offense, because from what I've seen of Turner, he does a lot of things that help a quarterback. As I've said 100 times already here, he motions guys around and he creates mismatches with formations and personnel groupings and what have you. And that's very quarterback friendly stuff. And from a terminology standpoint, it should be a system that is easier to pick up for Haskins than the West Coast offense was. So you hope that he buys in and he's able to pick it all up. And if so, then it should be more productive than it was last year, because last year there was clearly a split from the coaches to the front office of what they wanted to do with their quarterback situation. And Haskins clearly wasn't the guy that they wanted to go with at the start of last year. And you understand why, because, you don't necessarily want to be starting a rookie quarterback in a year that you have to win and get to the playoffs. So, it wasn't a good situation for both Haskins and the coaching staff last year. So this year is a much better situation for him, and you hope that he buys in, and you hope that he does the work, and if he does, then I think it works. But we've heard a lot about them kind of reluctance to really confirm he's their guy, and he's not their guy yet, because it's a new regime and they didn't draft him, so he's not going to be their guy, and he's got to prove it to them. But I think that is kind of the right thing to do. I don't think anyone should be handed the job. I think they should have to prove it, and hopefully he will.
Yeah.
And
I mean, last year
the Bill Callahan offense, right? The 8 points a game.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we saw when Kevin O'Connell got a little bit more of the reins last year and was allowed to, throw the ball on more than just 3rd and 10. It was a lot better, and we saw Haskins come along pretty well at the end of that year. Right. I think, and Turner likes to pass the ball. I mean, he throws the ball a lot more than he runs, so that probably will appeal to Haskins a lot more.
I mean, the Redskins offense last year generally reminded me of like a family undergoing a divorce. It's like you had the parents who were fighting, completely dysfunctional, didn't talk, and so then the kids have to go move in with the crazy uncle, for a while while their parents figured things out. And Bill Callahan was a crazy uncle, and the beginning of the year was just completely dysfunctional. Nothing worked. Jay Gruden knew he was gone. I'm not. You couldn't have brought in Dwayne Haskins in a worse situation. I hope to think that this Scott Turner, Ron Rivera marriage will be good for him in the sense that while he has to learn a new offense, it's also going to bring stability. It's going to bring an adult in the room who's not the crazy uncle. These two guys want him to succeed, and they've done it before. They did it with Cam Newton. So I'm looking forward to it in that respect.
I think the key there is that it's going to be all on the same page, and because at a point last year we had Kevin O'Connell calling plays with a run mandate from Bill Callahan, and they were running Jay Gruden's version of the West Coast offense. So it was Kevin O'Connell calling Bill Callahan's version of Jay Gruden's offense, and so
it's dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional divorce. I'm exactly
completely
right.
Dysfunctional. So, and I think if you have in an ideal world, I think Jay Gruden's calling one version of an offense. I think Bill Callahan's never calling a pass play in his life. And I think Kevin O'Connell is running a more Patriot-style system with probably a different terminology. So you had a really bad setup for him in his rookie year, whereas I think this year you're going to have everyone on the same page. So I think that will benefit him.
I think O'Connell would have wanted to go to that Earhart-Perkins system if he had really been able to give in his druthers.
And, maybe O'Connell would have been able to keep the West Coast offense terminology and kind of just run a Patriot-style system with West Coast offense terminology. But, you're right. He could well have switched it.
But we were stuck in 1962 with Crazy Uncle Bill.
Yeah, exactly.
Which sounds like an Animal House movie. Stuck in 1962 with the Crazy Uncle Bill. Bill Murray,
It is. Alex, you want to move to our
let's move to the
topic?
last topic because we only got a couple minutes left. This is a good news story that I thought would be the focus of our show early on this week before anything happened. And the Redskins early last week announced, or maybe it was late last week. We didn't cover it though. They have hired the first African American woman assistant coach, Jennifer King, who
hired the first woman. Period. Right? Oh no, San Francisco has one too.
Yeah. There are other women coaches.
Okay.
Assistant coaches, I should say. This is the first African American woman coach. So that's a big step forward for progress, which is great. Because it's coaching, women can coach. It's not that hard. You don't have to be.
Well, here's the thing, Alex. Here's what's wonderful about it to me. Number one, her title is full year intern, not assistant coach. So she's not a permanent. Not a permanent hire. Okay, but the thing is this. No, it's a full year position. It's like a 1 year paid coaching intern type position. The press release from the Redskins said she's hired as a full year intern. That's what it said. Yeah. But here's the great thing about it is it doesn't really matter about her gender or her race.
No.
I'm not discounting those things because you're right. It's progress. But the great thing is this is somebody Ron Rivera worked with before. Mm-hmm. He trusts her to play a role. And I don't know if Ron or Jennifer care whatsoever that it's progress. They just care that she's there to play a role. And that's the way it should be. And I think that's great. From my 2 cents.
Well, I think everyone, other than maybe one old curmudgeon, is like, women can't do things. Like I think everyone thinks it's good news, and in that progress category. But
I just hope we get to the point where it doesn't matter. That's the point.
Yeah, and I think we're getting there. And if you look at her resume, she's more than qualified to do this kind of job. She was a head basketball coach. She played in the. I don't remember what the name of the women's league is. Did you know there's like 200 women's pro football teams or semi-pro football teams?
I was going to say the DC Divas has been around for 30,000 years.
Yeah. I think she played on the Divas.
So much coaching experience available from the women's perspective.
Yeah. I think she played on the Divas for a year. So, she's played pro football, at least in the women's leagues. This is a person who's eminently qualified to be a coach. So it's great. And it was just a good story for the Redskins.
Yeah. Jamal, should we tempt your mic again?
No. I'm only good for a few seconds. I'm not even going to waste my time. I apologize to everybody that's listening.
Yeah.
Right. Jamal has been silent because of technical problems, not because we don't like Jamal.
Right.
Mark, do you have any insight into Jennifer King other than what we've talked about?
Well, it was my colleague at The Athletic, Rhiannon Walker, that broke the story, and she did a good profile on her, and she interviewed a bunch of players that had played under her, and one of those was Rashad Ross, who was a former Redskin and now in the XFL with the DC Defenders.
Yeah, I'll be watching them as soon as we're done with the show.
Yeah, so the reports back from the players that have played under her say that she's a good coach and they've learned things from her. And I think the key for any coach is, can they give things for their players to learn from? And if they have something to offer to their players, then the players aren't going to care their race or their gender. And so it's a good move. I like that they're doing it. They don't lose anything from doing it, and and I hope it helps bring more female coaches and different race coaches into the league. And I just hope it's not seen as some sort of PR stunt to try to generate some positive PR for the Redskins.
I don't think Ron would do that, though.
I don't think Ron would do that either. I'm hoping that, and I think Ron's hiring her on legitimate means. And I mean, we've just said that like she has a legitimate position there, and she's earned it. I just hope that the fan perception is that it's not a PR stunt to generate some good PR, because things like the name debate and what have you.
Benefit is the larger point.
Sure. I just hope people don't see it as, oh, this is just a PR stunt.
Oh, yeah. No.
She won't do anything. Like, I hope people give her the legitimacy of the, like, well, she's been hired as a coach, let's treat her as a coach.
Right. I think we'd all do that.
And the truth of the matter is, we might not hear a single thing about her again for the rest of the year. We tend to not hear about these, assistant coaches and whatnot, and that's the way it should be. She needs to do her thing, and that's it.
I think she's going to be working with the running backs. Is that right?
Yeah, running.
Yeah,
backs.
Randy Jordan. She's going to be kind of assisting Randy Jordan.
Right. So hopefully she can get, if she can figure out a way to get Darius Geis and Bryce Love to not be hurt, like I'll be happy.
They need to just wrap those guys in bubbles. That's all.
Right. Can she stand on the sideline with one of those industrial things of bubble wrap?
Hey, Mark, have you guys at The Athletic heard anything about Bryce Love's status in terms of how his rehab's going, anything like that? We've heard absolutely nothing.
No, I've not heard anything. No one's told anything to me about it. I would assume Ben or Rhiannon will probably follow that up relatively soon, but I think we're kind of all waiting for the combine to get a chance to speak to Rivera and Carl Smith.
Speaking of the combine, are you Team Chase or are you on my side, which is the Redskins need to trade down?
I'm kind of sitting on the fence at the moment. My feeling is to draft Chase Young unless you get an offer that blows you away, and I have yet to decide exactly what that offer is. I think I hope that they're a little bit more prepared than me, and that they've got an idea in their mind that this is what it's going to take, and for us to trade back. And if they have, that's great. But and they should stick to that price. And if they don't get exactly that price or more, then don't trade back, because Chase Young is a really, really, really good player, and he will improve everyone, and he will impact more plays than anybody else in this draft. So
Steve is in the. He will take another first-round pick and a conditional 7th for a trade back at this point.
I didn't say that. Not that I don't like Chase Young. It's that I think there's so many other holes in this roster. How on earth can you draft a defensive end when you don't have a starting middle linebacker? You don't have any starting guards. I mean, come on, people.
So what if they got a receiver and they got a linebacker in free agency? How are you going to? What's your approach?
What's Trent's status in your hypothetical?
Trent's status is he's a Redskin.
Okay, so if you have a middle linebacker, you have a receiver, Trent's back, that fills a lot of holes, and I feel a lot better about it, because to me the huge hole is middle linebacker, not edge rusher. That's the guy you really need. Isaiah Simmons is the guy you really need, not Chase Young to me.
So I asked that only because I don't think you're right or wrong in this. Like, it's all your opinion, but I asked that because we got to take into account that there's so many different levels or layers before we even get to the draft. So Chase Young is still the best option. At 2, you have so much going for you, but you know what I'm saying, that like there's so many things that can happen prior to the draft. It makes so much sense to take Chase, but I am willing to listen to the offers. And if they're really good and I can move back 1 or 2 spots, then hey, I'll entertain it.
I just want one person to come on here and say, you know what, Steve, you're absolutely right. That's what I'm looking for.
I think there's a scenario where you are right. I just don't think it's for, like, if you can just get 1 or 2 extra picks. I want a bounty of picks to move off of a guy that I think is such a top talent, and I think he would improve everyone else on the defense. I did a profile on Isaiah Simmons recently, and he's a really good player, and he can be something that is kind of rare in the NFL in terms of being so good in coverage and so versatile in coverage, but he has deficiencies in the run game. He doesn't impact. There are plays where he doesn't impact plays, or he negatively can impact plays by missing an assignment or what have you. Whereas Chase Young, from the years of watching players, and admittedly I usually study players that are likely to go to the Redskins, so I don't always study the best players. But from the years of watching players that I have, I've not seen someone impact as many plays as Chase Young did from studying him this year. And I think when you look for a top draft pick to start building an organization, I remember they're in year one of a new regime. They don't have to win this year, so why not start building with the best possible player you can get that impacts the most possible plays? And in an ideal situation, he's your Julius Peppers pass rusher for the next 10, 15 years. Yep. I think that makes a ton of sense to sit there at 2 and take that, unless you get an offer of 12 first-round picks that you can't turn down.
That's a lot of picks,
12 first-round picks. I think we all agree to take 12 first-round picks.
Like maybe I come down to 3 and something else, but like I think there is a price, but
Mark,
I think
it's negotiating, right? You drop the 12 to 3 really quick.
Yeah, I'll be down to a 7th soon. I think there is certainly a price for him. I just think it's an expensive one, and I think what Jamal said about free agency is a very good point. We don't know what they're going to do in free agency yet. The team's going to look completely different by the time the draft comes around, and they can acquire picks a different way. They can trade off different players. They can move back from other picks. They can an idea I was playing with this morning on Twitter was the Cardinals reportedly thinking about trading David Johnson with a draft pick to get rid of his contract, kind of like Brock Osweiler when the Texans and the Browns did a few years ago.
Yeah, I would do that. That's a great move.
And he'd be an $11 million cap hit this year, but you can create you kind of made $11 million from Richardson. He was 8 or 9.
They can create
11.5.
They could definitely afford it, with Kerrigan was $11 million and Reed's another 8 or something, so they could afford it, and you could take on a David Johnson, and he would traditionally what he did well was being able to move around. He was Christian McCaffrey before Christian McCaffrey was drafted, so he would, based on that skill set, he would fit what Turner does, so they'd have a chance of turning him around. But if he doesn't pan out and he's just an $11 million cap hit, then you can cut him next year for relatively cheap, and you might be able to get a 2nd or a 3rd round pick out of that. So there are creative ways that you can get draft picks without giving up a talent like Chase Young, and I think that is kind of the level I'm on.
All right, well, I think we have to wrap up this week's episode, guys, because I've got to go to the Defenders game and meet up with Rick Snyder and Matt. And possibly crash their podcast. I'm not really sure. Fans will know if I do.
Nice humble brag. They're out.
I'm excited. It's going to be fun. I'm going to be freezing, but it'll be fun. Mark, thank you for joining us as always. It's always great to see. Well, not see you sometimes since you don't have a webcam right now. But always great to hear from you.
Yeah, it's always good to be on. It's always a laugh. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it.
Jamal, I'm sorry that your mic crapped out on you twice in this show.
Look, one of these days, we're gonna put up some funds to get me a mic.
Yeah.
That's sustainable.
Maybe if we buy a mixer, I can give you one of my old mics.
As soon as that Manscaped money comes in.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the Manscaped.
We don't have
money,
them
right?
anymore. They're not a sponsor anymore. Don't buy their stuff.
That's right. Yeah, stop.
All right. Thank you all for joining us, and hope you had a good long weekend.
In 1957, Laika became the first animal to orbit Earth. What kind of animal was Laika?
What is the only team in the Big Four North American sports leagues which shares its name with one of the Avengers?
And here's one more question for you. Are you the type of person who enjoys playing trivia games, learning new things, and having a bit of fun along the way?
If you are, or if you just want to find out the answers to those other questions, then our podcast, Quiz and Hers, might be right up your alley.
Each week, one of us writes new trivia questions for the other person, covering everything from science to history to pop culture to sports.
And every question in a game relates to some theme, like Game of Thrones,
Internet memes,
sandwiches,
or animals in space.
Some of the themes make more sense than others.
So if you like trivia, learning, or real couples testing each other's knowledge and patience, check out our podcast, Quiz and Hers, part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network.
Quiz and Hers, the trivia podcast where we test each other's knowledge and the strength of our relationship.